Hey, what's up, everybody? DPR here. I want to talk some today about entanglement props and some of the training wounds and training scars that we create using these props. Now, there's two things that I'll put up right up front. Number one, everything I talk about, all these trigger points that I'm going to say that we should avoid are things that I've done myself in the past. I try to be that person who does not say, hey, this is the way we do it here, and not learn. Okay, so a lot of the points that I make, I've learned through reading and research and conversations, and just a lot of times sitting here thinking about how we do stuff and how we can make it even better. Okay? Second point is, for all that I say about these entanglement props, I'm not saying not to use them. I'm not saying they don't have an important place in firefighter training. I think they're very important. I think the skills that we can develop in the entanglement props are absolutely crucial to firefighter safety and survival. What I do think is we need to look at how we're using these props and make sure that we're not creating training wounds and training scars that in the long run will decrease the probability or the possibility of firefighters being able to work their way through an entanglement hazard. So those are the two things that I want to say right up front. Now, as we start to walk down the road, what we need to understand is that if you were put into an entanglement situation in real life, a lot of things are going to happen. Okay, I'm not going to talk too much about physical fitness, but it deserves mention here. If you're not a physically fit firefighter and your pulse rate is already elevated because you're having a hard time completing your task, if you end up in this entanglement situation, there are a whole bunch of chemical reactions that's going to happen in your body that's going to elevate your pulse rate even more than what it is. It's not a long walk to take an unfit firefighter, put them in a demanding situation, and then throw something on top of them like an entanglement hazard to have their pulse rate exceed 180. And we know from the work that Grossman quotes and a lot of other very, very smart people, when you get past a pulse rate of 180, you lose all your abilities. At that point, you're just going to crawl up in a ball and let the incident dictate the outcome. In a survival situation, that's never a good place to put yourself. So we want to make sure people are physically fit. Okay? The next thing that we have to think about when we talk about survival and survival situations are, as our pulse rate increases, we start to lose the ability for cognitive reasoning. We start moving out of the prefrontal cortex into the lizard brain where it's just all about survival, fight, flight, or freeze. The way we end up prevailing in these situations is by building good reasoning and skills on the front end before things happen, so that when you start moving from the rational side of your brain into the survival side of your brain, your training kicks in. You've built those skills, you have those sets and reps, all these neural pathways start kicking in to give you the best chance for survival. So that's where I want to really focus this conversation. Now, we know for a fact that human beings learn, adults learn by chunking information. I learn this chunk, and then I learn the next chunk, and I learn the next chunk. If we just throw the entire thing at somebody at one time, they're going to have a hard time replicating what we're trying to teach them, high threat, high stress situation. So the very first thing that I'll say about this type of training, and I'm talking to chiefs and I'm talking to training officers right now, is we have to understand that the process to build the end state, which are trained, competent firefighters who can overcome a life-threatening survival situation, takes a long time. Okay? I've written training schedules. I've run training academies. I've allotted 16 hours for firefighter survival training, and I got a little lecture that we do real quick, and then we move through like 4 or 5 different skills. There's no way, absolutely no way, we're really going to produce the level of skill and ability in our firefighters that they need to have to overcome these situations in an 16-hour block. In my opinion, thinking real hard about everything, doing the research, having the conversations, talking to people like Basil Ibrahim and Robert Ramirez and Rick George and all these folks in the fire service that are just so smart when it comes to these subjects, man. I think 32, maybe 40 hours, maybe even more than that, is what we need to allot in entry level training to produce the skills and the abilities that people need to have if they get caught in one of these situations. So that's, the very first thing to think about. I think that we just don't allot enough time to get these things done. Okay? Number two, we tell people all the time, don't turn your flashlight on. We want to put people in limited visibility environments, and we don't allow them to use flashlights because we want visibility to be limited. Or we're going to black their face pieces out altogether, and we don't tell people, hey, turn your flashlight on. By doing that, we build the habit of people turning their flashlights on. In my opinion, morning, noon, or night, doesn't matter. 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon with bright sun, you should not come off the apparatus without your flashlights on. I see this all the time on fire grounds. People run around, they don't have their flashlights on. So I'm that OV guy. I'm headed to the Charlie side. I don't have my flashlight on, and I get to the Charlie side and I force a door or something happens, or I see a handprint on a window, something that makes me enter into that limited visibility situation. If I don't have the habit of turning my flashlight on, I get in there, I don't have my flashlight on. Well, as soon as I get in there, if I get down on the floor, now I've got some visibility, but my flashlight isn't on. So, number one thing, make sure, not only just in the tangle boxes, but anytime you're working in limited visibility training situations, you make sure people turn their flashlights on. Absolutely number one. Number two, that we do with these entanglement props is we make a big deal about people carrying wire cutters in their pocket. But when we go to train, we got one box set up and we don't let them use their wire cutters. We are building, in my opinion, a false sense of security in people by telling them to carry wire cutters without allowing them to use the wire cutters in training. I carry my wire cutters. We got one tangle box. Hey, don't cut the wires. Just work your way through. Blah, blah, blah. Chiefs, training officers, if you're going to use these props, you got to do two things, in my opinion. Number one is you got to have multiple props at the training site. So you put people in, they cut wire, you move that out of the way, and then you just seamlessly, you go into the next prop. Okay? By the time people get through that, you've got the first prop ready to go. If you're training a lot of people, maybe you need to build 2, 3, maybe 4 of these props. And the other thing that you need to do is you need to have enough staffing there so that as soon as somebody goes through the prop, you move it out of the way and there's someone there that can start resetting that prop. Because a lot of instructors don't let students use their wire cutters because they're there by themselves and they got one prop. And they don't want to have to, stop training for 20 minutes to reset the prop. And if you're going to let people use their wire cutters and you only have one prop, you're going to stop training for 20 minutes to reset the prop. And the training value is going to go right, down the tubes. Because people are going to stand there with their arms crossed, say, okay, you got to have multiple props. You got to give people the opportunity to use their wire cutters in training, because if you don't and they got to use these things and they go for them, they drop, they fumble them or whatever, all these little things that happen because we haven't given people the ability to train prior to the event adds to the increase in pulse rate. So if you're at 170 and you start fumbling around with your wire cutters because you've never had a chance to practice using these in a high stress environment, now all of a sudden apprehension kicks in even more than what it already is. You get another dump of hormones and chemicals, and now you're over 180 and you just kind of curl up in a ball and you can connect the dots from there. You can see what happens. Third thing that we need to think about when we use these props is if you get caught in an entanglement situation, you're probably already engaged in firefighting tasks, which means that your pulse rate is already elevated. You're already working, 180, if I remember the numbers correctly, from On Combat by Grossman, 180 is the real point where you go into condition black and everything just shuts down. So when we put people in these props, maybe they're a little bit apprehensive, maybe their pulse rate's a little bit up, but they're standing, for the most part, they're just standing around waiting their turn. So if I put people into these props, what I want to do is I want to get them in there with an elevated pulse rate already, because that's what's going to happen to them on the fire ground. So before I put them in there, do 20 jumping jacks, pick up a 30-pound kettlebell bell, walk 50 feet, come back, put the bell down, get into the prop. So now, as they encounter the entanglements, their pulse rate's already up. I think what we should do is when we build these props, don't use the standard, do more than the 8-foot prop. And that's, and I built a ton of these things, they're 8 foot long because I use 8-foot sheets of plywood. I think what we should be doing is make a 12-foot prop so that the students, the participants, they elevate their pulse rate, they start working through the prop, and then they encounter the hazard. A lot of times what we do is as soon as they get into the prop, right away they encounter the hazard. So as they have to move into the hazard zone, of course their apprehension is going up and their pulse rate is going up, and then they hit the entanglement. And think about it, most of these entanglements are not going to happen as soon as you break the threshold of the IDLH environment. You're going to be inside, moving, making progress, and then all of a sudden something happens. So that's another point. One of the biggest issues I see with a lot of the way people use these props to train is that as soon as they hit the entanglement, they don't call a mayday. Okay? Go back to what I said about chunking. People learn how to do a task by breaking it down into chunks. So I think if we really want to be effective and have the end state of firefighters who have developed skills to navigate these situations, we give them a lecture. We talk to them all about these hazards and all these things that I've just mentioned. We talk to them about that psychomotor response and the chemical dump. We talk to them about all those different stages, green, yellow, orange. We talk to them about what happens when you hit condition black. We talk to them about the difference between the prefrontal cortex and the lizard brain. We lay all that information out for them. The next piece of the puzzle is putting them in difficult positions and just having them call their mayday. Okay? Absolutely no doubt in my mind, get away from lunar, use who, what, and where. The most important item that, in my opinion, should come out first is where. Where are you? If I'm in command and I don't hear anything other than mayday, 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 second floor, Alpha Bravo corner, at least I know where to go. Okay? So let's make sure people can call maydays. And then put them in difficult positions, put them on their belly, put them on their side, put them in a reduced profile situation, put them going through a wall and having to grab your mic and call mayday. So now We gave them all the knowledge. They're competent in being able to call the Mayday. Now we start putting them into these other situations. So if we're using that 12-foot box, like I recommend, they're crawling through the box. As soon as they hit the hazard, the first thing they do is they call a Mayday. So we're building those skills. If we don't build these skills in training, and I'll say this, if you're doing any type of hands-on practical training with any group of firefighters, the instructors should say to themselves, on the very next tour, these people spend in the firehouse, they're going to have to do the skill that I just taught them. So let's make sure their skills are where they need to be at that proficiency level. If we're teaching these things in Recruit Academy, okay, they get out of Recruit Academy, they have their survival block halfway through their academy. Say they got a 12-week, say they got an 18-week academy. Toward the end of the academy, week 14, we do survival skills. Then we do a couple other things. They graduate, boom, they go off to their companies. 2 or 3 months down the road, they're not in real busy companies. Now they get caught in one of these entanglement things. So we want to make sure that everything that we do is producing the skills that they will be able to do next day, and hope that it never happens. Build these skills so deep with so much understanding and so much practice that if this doesn't happen for 12 years, they'll still be able to fall back on their effective training. So as I say, we move through the prop. As soon as they hit the hazard, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. If I don't do that in recruit school, and the recruit ends up in an entanglement on their second or third tour, they're going to go right back to their training, because that's, the law of recency. What I learned most recent is what I do. So if we don't make them call a Mayday in the training, they're not going to call it a Mayday when they get tangled up in the wires. We make these assumptions that everybody knows everything, and they don't, because we end up in lizard brain, pulse rates climbing toward 180. We fall back on our training, and we produce these wounds in training that if we don't correct, they become scars, which means this is the way people operate in the real world. So as soon as they hit that hazard, they call a Mayday. The last, and what I've really come to realize is the biggest problem with this is when we teach this, we teach people to move through the hazard. Okay? If I'm on my way out and I get tangled up, then I need to be able to get over on my back and navigate the hazard to get out. But if I've come from safe and I get tangled up, why am I going to flip over on my back, get out of this, and continue to move forward? It makes no sense, but that's what we're teaching people to do, because we don't sit down and have these conversations with them. So I would say to you, well, the first thing I'll tell you in real world experience, I got tangled up in wires one time in a high-rise building, and it wasn't real bad. I wasn't in a real jam. I was able to get out of it pretty quick by myself, just kind of pushing the stuff off my shoulder. I had one drop down on my cylinder. I was able to manipulate that. But once I was free and clear, and I knew I wasn't tangled up anymore, hey, man, I took a time out. Okay? It is totally unrealistic for us to expect people to get into an entanglement situation, to be able to swim their way out, and then continue with the task they were given that put them moving to the point where they got entangled. So what I say is, when we start using these props, we have to build that muscle memory in people. We have to give them the knowledge to say, if they're moving and they've come from safe, as soon as they get tangled, they want to retreat. They want to get out of what's entangling them, and get back to safe. Okay? We still need to be able to get over on our back and swim in case the entanglement happens on our way out to safe. But we really need to think about this, because I'm telling you, from when I've seen people train new firefighters, a new firefighter, freshly trained, going out to the field and getting caught in one of these situations fairly new into their career are not going to call a mayday, and they're going to revert back to their training, get over on their back, swim through the hazard, and keep moving. You're moving into danger. Safe is behind you because that's where you came. So those are the things that I have to say. Always, 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 and there's not many times I say always, but I'm saying it now. Any type of limited visibility training, have people turn their flashlights on. Okay? If we're going to get involved in survival training, before we put them into the situation, elevate their pulse rate, because their pulse rates are going to be elevated on the fire ground. Always, always, if we put them in a stress situation, a survival situation, make sure they call Mayday. Make sure they know that if they are moving from safe into hazard, if they get caught in one of these situations, free themselves from the hazard and go back to safe. Do not continue to move forward. And the last thing is, if we're going to have people carry wire cutters, then we've got to give them the ability to train on how to use those wire cutters. So we got to have multiple props. We've got to dedicate the money. We got to dedicate the resources, and we got to dedicate the staff so we can allow people to have an effective, productive training session using the tools that we tell everybody to use. So that's my thoughts on this. Kind of a long video. Hope it resonates. As always, look, I'm not an expert. Yeah, I'm just a guy who's been doing a lot of work for a long time, who's thought about a lot of stuff. This is what I think makes the most sense. If you see a fault or a flaw in what I said, please put it up in the comments, because the more conversations we have, the more we look at these issues, the better off we're going to be able to produce effective training that's going to allow our people to prosecute the mission, and it's going to allow them to dominate situations when they get into trouble. So thanks for your time, man. I hope it all makes sense. Like I said, feedback, I'm more than willing to listen, engage in conversations. Let's just make it better tomorrow than what we're doing today. Thanks for your time, and remember that the comfort zone is where excellence goes to die.